So my name is Nasia Safdar. I serve as the faculty director for this series. I'm delighted to introduce Calleen Roper as our speaker today. Calleen serves as the director of research in the Department of Medicine, where she provides strategic and operational leadership for a large complex research enterprise that supports more than 150 million in annual funding. With a background spanning research administration, finance, compliance, and organizational strategy, she has led multi-site operations across academic medical centers and research institutes. Calleen has a master's in public administration, is a certified research administrator, and is a recognized leader in the field. She's an active national presenter and author on topics including research administration, change management, federal compliance, and funding strategy. Thank you, Calleen, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Nasia, and thank you for the opportunity and for those of us joining us today. So as Nasia said, we're going to talk about clinical trial budgeting and what all PIs should know going in. I'm going to say this is not in depth because we could be here all day for that type of a topic, but we'll kind of cover the broad scopes of the most important areas to keep in mind. So for today, we're going to talk about the different types of clinical trial research opportunities, understanding budget requirements across clinical trial funding sponsors and platforms, and things to consider when you're serving as a PI for a clinical trial. So our overall kind of agenda for the day, we're going to talk about the background of clinical trial information, PI's expectations for serving on a clinical trial, and then an overview of the different types of clinical trial funding and how we go about budgeting and managing those. So we're going to kick off with the difference between clinical research versus clinical trials. So clinical research is a broad, overarching study that involves human subjects, and the goal is to understand, prevent disease, find different potential healthcare opportunities for them, and it requires human volunteers to evaluate the safety, as it says here, safety, efficacy, effectiveness, and mechanisms of treating new. Sorry, words are doing well today. So it's evaluating safety and effectiveness and efficacy of new treatment drugs, medical devices, diagnostic methods, even healthcare patterns of behavior can be involved in clinical research. Clinical trials specifically are related to prospectively assigning human participants to interventions. That can be drugs, devices, procedures, behaviors, etc., to evaluate safety and efficacy. Clinical trials are a branch of clinical research, but not all clinical research is a clinical trial. So clinical research can typically be divided into three broad categories. This can be interventional studies. So we have we're testing new drugs, new devices or procedures, behavioral treatments to see if they prevent or treat diseases. Observational studies where we're not giving them any intervention or not changing their treatment, but looking how treatment evolves across different diagnoses, treatment methods. Does one drug work better than another drug for the same disease? And are patient outcomes different based on how we care for our clinical patients? And then the third can be registry studies. And whether your department puts registry under the clinical trial or general research is really up to them, but it can fit in both areas. And registries tend to follow clinical trial budgeting. So I have looped this in here as we are starting to see that lean more toward that avenue. But registries is really just about collecting data that can help give us long-term data on various diagnoses, how drug treatments are impacted, or whether or not they're impacting patient care or not, if there's new techniques, if we're monitoring different things. So it can help collect a lot of data that we can use for analysis to determine if we have opportunities for research areas. So PI expectations. Ultimately, PIs are responsible for the study. You are listed as the principal investigator, therefore you are the name and the person who is going to be responsible for understanding everything that's going on. And if there's questions or concerns about the study, if things are happening as they should be, or if things are getting missed, at the end of the day, your name's on it. You are where the buck stops. So you've got to know what's going on, what's expected of you, and whether or not you're meeting the needs of that clinical study. I will also say that conversations with a sponsor and saying, yeah, we want to do the study does not actually equal approval. So there are multiple steps that we actually do have to go through within departments, across campus, within the dean's office, to actually become a study that is engaged in a clinical trial activity. So we can see this sometimes where faculty will say, well, I've already approved being part of this study, so therefore we have to do it. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case. So as a PI, when you're talking with sponsors about potential clinical trial activities, we want to demonstrate our interest, our enthusiasm, but you don't want to commit until you know that you can actually do that and it's gone through all of the internal approvals. If it's not in the contract or the study protocol, don't do it. You can't do it. If you do something that's not in the contract or the study protocol, there's no guarantees you're getting paid for it, that you can't be reprimanded for it because it's outside of what's going on. So if you're going to make a change, if you need to make a tweak outside of patient care, obviously if you're in the middle of a procedure and something happens that's not in the protocol, but you need to do it to see to patient safety, that's an exception. But, don't add extra procedures because you think it'd be interesting to find out the information or that it would add extra benefit to the study without having those conversations beforehand. And study activation as a site actually begins when your administrators have all of the required documents in order to move the study forward. Those documents, and we'll get into a little more detail on some of these, but are your contract, your budget, your regulatory stuff for IRB submission, any lab manuals, pharmacy manuals, et cetera, anything that we need in order to fully assess whether we can feasibly participate in that project, understand the contract and terms that we're agreeing to, and negotiate the budget. So we need all of those in place before activation even begins at our site. So just starting the conversation with the sponsor is not activation of the site. And award closeout. We have a very limited window when a clinical trial ends to get final invoices in, to wrap up final reports and data. So we want to make sure at award closeout that you as the PI, there are things you're going to have to sign off on and review and certify that you're doing that in a really timely manner so that we don't potentially lose funding because we've waited too long to do things. And last but not least, ask for permission. Forgiveness is not guaranteed in any research platform, let alone in clinical trial research. So again, if you're wanting to make changes, if you think things need to be altered, if you have a piece of equipment that breaks down and you need to replace it, don't presume that the sponsor is going to take care of it or cover it, or that your rationale is going to be sufficient. We need to be asking for permission to make sure that we get those costs, those activities, and your time covered. From PI expectations, we're going to talk a little bit about indirect cost rates. So these are the costs that come back to the university for the administration of clinical trials. This can be, and as you can see here, we have 3 different rates. So it depends on the type of clinical trial that you're doing will dictate what that indirect cost rate is. And so indirect costs, for those who aren't aware, are those activities that help keep the lights on in our buildings, pay for the maintenance of our research and lab spaces. If we're working in clinical settings or have research activities taking place in clinic, they're helping to maintain those clinic spaces to some degree. The staff that go into some of this, there's a lot of administrative functions that clinical trials don't pay for. So these indirect costs help kind of cover all of those background expenses that sponsors won't typically allow us to directly charge to them. And within clinical trial research, there's two types of indirect costs. One is total direct costs, and the other is modified. What that basically means is when we charge indirects, it's based on what you spend. And so under total direct costs, you get charged whatever that percentage is of indirects to every single expense that hits your budget. If it's modified, there are some exceptions. So things like capital equipment or tuition, subawards over a certain dollar threshold, those will be excluded from what gets charged indirect costs. So there is a difference between those. So it's important to understand what indirects are going to be charged on to understand how much of your budget the indirects are going to potentially take up or be need to be inclusive of. So we're going to talk through the three of these: organized research versus industry-funded research versus clinical trials that are industry-sponsored or funded. As you can see, there's three different types of rates here. So if it's organized research, this is really your grants, so your federal sponsors, your nonprofits, potentially state. That's going to be at a 55.5%. So for every dollar that you charge on your grant, we're going to have 55.5% of that. So 55 cents is going to get charged in indirects for every dollar that you charge. For industry-funded research, so industry-funded grants, that comes with a 64%. And that's charged on every single expense that comes through because it's under that total direct costs. Industry sponsored and funded, much lower, 32%. That is, all of these percentages are things that we negotiate with the federal government that are set based on our costs across campus for our facilities, for our maintenance, electricity, all of those things. That's what decides all of these percentages. And I will say, as you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll try and keep track of those and answer them as we go too. So we're going to talk a bit about federal funding and federally funded clinical trials. So these are proposals that you're submitting to the federal government that they have dictated fall into a clinical trial framework. So NIH, Department of Defense or Department of War now, CDC, VA, FDA, et cetera. These are all typical federal funding agencies for grants. And grants can then be clinical trial-based or non-clinical trials. And on the NIH side, you also have an optional application process for that as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between research grants versus federal contracts as well. So timelines, submissions, the terms of what goes into all of these, how they're negotiated when they're awarded, things like that will all differ depending on if it's a grant versus a contract. So for instance, grants, if you're familiar with NIH funding, we put together a research proposal. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to research. This is the impact I think it's going to have, and what we're hoping the outcome will demonstrate. And we put a budget behind that. We put in some CVs and bio sketches. We put in human subjects protections, etc. A lot of that same information will go into a contract, but the proposal process is a little bit different. On research grants, you're submitting the proposal, and if you get awarded, then there's some ability to negotiate terms at award period. With federal contracts, we have to review all of that contract language at the proposal stage. And if we plan to negotiate any of those contract terms, we have to state that at the proposal point. So getting those agreements or those contracts to RSP early is really important so that they have time, because if they don't At the time of proposal submission, if they don't identify that they need to negotiate some of those terms, they will not have the opportunity to do so later, which could cost you the ability to actually accept the award at that point. So being aware of the difference between grants and contracts is important in this space. Grants are also allowing you to investigate your idea and tell the funder how it turns out. It could turn out that your research proposal shows that there's absolutely no correlation, no benefit to whatever it is you're researching or that you're proposing for implementation. Or it could show that there's massive impact, and maybe this is something we need to be adopting and doing and finding in practice. Whereas contracts are usually paying you to accomplish an actual task or service. For instance, if we want to know if flu vaccinations are improving the overall health outcomes of patients, is it reducing hospitalization rates? The CDC, DOD, et cetera, may pay us to go out and vaccinate people and track them to see what their health outcomes are for that flu year period. And they're paying us to basically vaccinate, track the data, and give them a report back. So we may want to know that for our own research benefit as well, and maybe that leads to other future research. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the federal government is just paying us to accomplish a service or a task and to provide an outcome for them. Contracts tend to be more prescriptive, they are regimented, they have direct sponsor oversight, where research grants have a little more wiggle room. You have a little more flexibility. You're able to discuss things with your program officer and shift sometimes in different directions depending on where the research is pointing. We're also going to talk a little bit about cost reimbursable versus fixed price agreements. So most grants, when they come in, are cost reimbursable, meaning you get paid back for every dollar that you spend. Whereas fixed price, and that's typically up to a set amount. So going back to cost reimbursable. So NIH, for instance, may say, we are awarding you a $1.5 million budget each year, and you have to stick to that. If you spend over that, they're not going to reimburse you more than that. But if you spend less than that, they're also not going to reimburse you the full 1.5 million. They're going to reimburse you only what you spend. Whereas fixed price, they may come back to you and say, we're going to give you $1.5 million to meet these deliverables. And at the end of the day, you're getting $1.5 million. If you spend less than that, great. You have a little bit left over, which we term as residuals here at UW. If you spend over that, you're not getting any more money. You're going to have to come up with that money, or your department's going to have to come up with that money to cover those overages. So understanding your grants and the contracts that are coming in, whether they're cost reimbursable versus fixed price, is also really important. On-court requirements. So at UW, if you're doing human subjects research, you likely have a requirement to do an on-core record. How in-depth that on-core record is to indicate how many subjects you have can depend on whether or not you need to track visits per patient visit, if you need to track the number of patients that you are enrolling per visit, if they're completing specific procedures, or if you're doing a one and done blood draw, you may not need to get into enrolling each participant. You can just say at the end of the study, we had 75 participants in it. So there's different requirements with Encore, and understanding what needs to be completed in that and tracked in that does depend on the type of study that you're doing. RAMP requirements. So every research project that runs through this university has to go through the RAMP system, which is the Research Administration Management Portal. And that is how we get our dean's office approvals, RSP approvals, sign-offs on contracts. All of that goes through that system for routing and approvals. So understanding that when we get a contract in, it's not as easy as just signing it. It's got to be routed through different people for approvals to get to RSP, so that RSP can then negotiate contracts, etc. There are PI requirements for ramp approvals. So you do have to go in and certify those records. So again, understanding as your role as the PI, how that process works and what your role is in completing those approvals. And then Workday. It's funny, this says the budgets that are listed, I'm going to have to correct this side. The budgets that are listed in Workday for industry-sponsored clinical trials are not real, which is what that should say. The budgets listed aren't real. They are real if they're grants. So we'll need to pay attention to that again as to whether or not the Workday numbers, the budget that is listed for Workday, if it's a grant, should align with the amount that you were awarded. Whereas if it's an industry-sponsored clinical trial, that's the total possible money you might get paid if you meet every single criteria. And I can tell you more often than not, that is not what actually happens. So those budgets aren't really real. You can't just say, oh, because I've got 500,000 listed as my budget, I've got $500,000 to spend. So understanding that, sorry, that flipped a little too fast there. Kind of perusing the chat here as I'm going. One of the questions that we had was, can we talk about the importance of Medicare coverage analysis happening early in the budgeting process to ensure compliance in clinical research billing and Medicare regulations? Yes, we will be talking about this. I have that on another slide, so we'll be getting to that. Another question is, how does a PCORI-funded clinical trial affect indirect percentages? PCORI is a nonprofit agency, so they fall under the grant side of this. And I did not list their specific indirect rate there, but our foundations, nonprofit agencies, they will typically have a, I was trying to go back a slide here. They will typically have a rate that is slightly different than our federally negotiated rates. So nonprofits and foundations have the ability to develop their own indirect trial rate. So I didn't list them here because they can be variable. Most foundations are around between 10 and 20% in indirect rates, whereas PCORI has set theirs at 40%. We're also going to talk about what happens if it's an industry sponsor giving funding to a foundation to run a grant, because that will also impact what that indirect cost rate looks like too. And next one was, please confirm, but PCORI-funded clinical trials do not affect your institution's negotiated F&A indirect cost rate, but they cap the maximum recoverable indirects at 40%. That is absolutely correct. And that's typically also listed in the calls for proposals with PCORI. They will tell you that they are limiting it to 40%. And if you try and do more than that, more than likely your grant's going to get triaged and or not reviewed because it doesn't follow their funding policies. So we talked about this. Getting back. So talk a little bit about budgets. So when we're talking in the grant space and federal budgeting categories, we're really looking at these categories that are listed here. So your personnel, your materials and supplies, if you're going to travel to conferences or present papers that are generated out of the research that you're doing. If you have contractual or service agreements for consultants or animals, if you have software licensing, things like that, that would go through this. Subawards, if you're working with collaborators at other institutions and you want to give them part of the money out of your research, those would be issued through subawards. And then some other direct costs that we can have, which would be study visit costs. So do we have procedures like you need to do lab draws or MRIs or CT scans or EKGs that are not part of standard of care and are only necessary for research? Those would fall under study visit costs. Participant incentives, are you paying your participants for their time and effort, an incentive to participate in the research? And do you have tuition? So in budgeting for grants, you need to budget. They will throw out potentially a dollar threshold, but you need to budget for what you need, because at the end of the day, what you get awarded is what you get. You can't go back and ask for more money. I shouldn't say that. You can. It's extraordinarily rare. So we're going to go with the premise of what you get awarded is what you get. You won't get more money if something happens and you overpay or you underpay or you need to shift your research plan. At the end of the day, when you come back to your federal sponsor, they're going to say, well, how are you going to shift your budget to make this work? Because they don't intend to give you more money for it. So knowing to budget for everything that you need. And here's just kind of an example. This is DOM's current grant research budget spreadsheet that we use. What you don't see here is typically on the right side of this, we have boxes for faculty to fill in the effort percentages for their personnel, to list kind of the materials and supplies they think they might need, to put if they have consultants or maintenance fees, research incentives, things like that, so they can fill that in and that auto populates to a lot of this. But this layout also tends to align with most federal proposal submissions, the categories that they ask for funding in. One of the questions that came in is, should you consider that you will likely need to chop your budget by 15 to 20% if awarded? Yes. You don't necessarily want to pad, but we do. So we want to be on the optimistic side of what we need to spend. Obviously staying within any dollar thresholds that the sponsors may throw out. But again, do what you need and put a little bit extra on there, because most sponsored agencies will cut your budget anywhere from 10 to 20%. It's leaning more toward that 15 to 20, given the federal climate right now. But you can expect that going in, that if you get your award, you should anticipate having the overall budget get cut. And then knowing that you're going to have to potentially plan where to make those cuts, should that happen. So we're going to transition now to industry sponsored. So out of the grant realm and into the industry. So this is going to be talking really about agencies like Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Eli Lilly, Roche coming to us and saying, hey, we have a clinical trial. We're going to run this study that's going to look at patients with propensity for heart attacks to see, or cardiomyopathy, and see if this catheter is going to work to help, open up lines, help blood flow, et cetera, or look at this drug to see if it reduces propensity for certain diseases or likelihood or outcomes. So they're coming to us and they're asking us if we want to participate as a site and enroll in these studies. I'm going to take one step back here to answer one of the questions that came in with the chat. So about the budgets getting cut at award, do we have a typical standard percent increase per year that we typically do, or whatever ends up being 10 to 20% of the total amount expected to be cut? So some of this depends on, so I'll flip back here for just a moment. Some of this depends on the agency. And again, if there is a set dollar threshold as to what you can request per year or over the overall total. So we do escalations in salary for the federal government. They don't like to see that. They will typically, if they see escalations, NIH in particular actually has a policy about this. If they see the escalation per year, they will usually cut your budget just for that. So what we typically do in the Department of Medicine is we do that escalation and then average it across the annual salaries across whatever years that we're doing it, so that we get an average, so that when we're entering it on the federal government side, it says a set salary for every year. In years 1 through 2, we likely pay less than what we're going to get paid from the sponsor, because we haven't reached that. In year 3, we're hopefully like on target. In years 4 and 5, we may pay slightly more than the salary average that we put in, but we've budgeted that so that in years 1 and 2 can make up for years 4 and 5. So we've done some wiggling there. Other areas that you can, again, be more optimistic on are your materials and supplies. If you know something's going to cost you, $500, you have an assay, it's going to cost you $500 to purchase, and maybe 10% of that, you're going to get an extra 10% on that for shipping. Maybe you bump it up to $550 with the 10% so that there's wiggle room. Again, if the sponsor or the vendor decides to increase their prices, you have a little wiggle room there. It also, because again, most of these grants don't get issued until anywhere from 6 months to a year after you submit the proposal as well. So pricing changes in that period of time. So there's different ways that you can kind of build in those escalations that help kind of buffer. And then, yeah, if you have cuts that come, knowing, okay, well, I probably overestimated slightly on my materials and supplies. I probably overestimated a bit in my shipping. Maybe I don't do publications in years 2 and 3. Maybe I only do it in 4 and 5, to kind of help make up some of those costs. So you can move that around a little bit. So we're going to talk about some of the things like CRU charges and things like that when we get into the industry sponsored side. So I'll address those questions and procedures as well across those areas too. So we'll get that coming up. Okay, so with industry sponsors like Pfizer, AstraZeneca coming to us, you get a mixture of two things. So Pfizer may come to us and say, hey, we have this great clinical trial. We want you guys to be part of this. Are you interested? We say, yep, this sounds fantastic. We would love to see more information so that we can potentially be a site. Sponsors will then either contract with us directly, meaning we're going to get all of the budget and regulatory information from Pfizer directly, or they may contract with a clinical research organization, a CRO, to have them handle that administrative piece of negotiating budgets and contracts, working on all of the regulatory documents with all of the sites. So quite often, especially with a lot of the larger companies like Pfizer, Eli Lilly, you may see a CRO come into the middle of it to work on those negotiations. So it's knowing, Pfizer may be running the grant, but you may be dealing with the CRO whenever you're having to talk about budgets or finances or getting payment and things like that. It's not necessarily the sponsor directly. Many of our industry sponsors, more often than not, will require confidentiality agreements in order to share study protocols with us. Again, these are novel research ideas. They're proprietary drug development that they're wanting us to go out and test in our patients and our populations. So more often than not, they're going to want us to sign a confidentiality agreement so that we can't disclose their research, their medication products, et cetera, to others. PIs need to keep in mind, you may have a section on there for it'll say like signing ability on there. You can sign it, but that actually doesn't obligate anybody but you as the PI to keep that information confidential. Those confidentiality agreements should be routing through RAMP. They should be routing through the university, and the agreement for confidentiality should be through the university and the industry sponsor, not personally you as a PI and the industry sponsor. So please don't sign those when you get them. Route them to your administrators so that they can help you with that. Clinical trials are contracted services. So you can't vary from that contract and what's in that contract without getting approval, written approval from the sponsor. To vary from that contract jeopardizes your ability to get paid for the work that you're doing. So we want to make sure that you recognize these are contracted service agreements. You don't get paid if it's not in there. And if you do something that is not in there, more than likely the sponsor is going to come back and say, that's your problem. So keep that in mind. Research billing reviews and Medicare compliance. So as this was in one of our questions, this is extraordinarily appropriate to know whether the procedures or the drugs that you're testing on patients, if they're Medicare approved. So especially if the industry sponsor comes back and tells us, oh, well, we're giving this as standard of care. We have to make sure that it can actually be billed to the insurance. Is this really something or procedures or activities that would happen in the general standard of care of these patients? Or are they asking us to do something that really is, we wouldn't do it if it wasn't for the research. And so understanding billing compliance for patient insurance versus research charges, understanding what can and cannot be billed to Medicare and therefore needs to be charged to the research. Things like that are really important, and that's where your administrative groups can help you. A lot of these activities, when we put them into our Encore system, they go through a billing and compliance review to verify Medicare coverage, that we have labeled things correctly. So it's when we're putting them through all those approvals for feasibility and management and stuff, a lot of that's getting checked. So it's important to know that that's happening in the background, much like when you're seeing a patient in the clinical area, whether or not they have insurance, Medicare, or having to pay out of pocket will help guide you as a clinician as to what type of medications you may prescribe to them. Likewise, that same thought has to go into the research activities that are occurring and knowing who's paying for what and when. Again, Encore requirements and ramp requirements. We still have to, much like grants, we still have to route this stuff through Encore. It has to be set up. We may have to have patient enrollment in Encore and tracking. There's ramp requirements for routing for approval for the dean's office to sign off, your departmental chairs, and for RSP to approve contracts that come in. And again, Workday, the budgets for industry-sponsored clinical trials are fake. You cannot look at the budget in Workday, and we'll get, actually, I don't think we do in this because, again, as I said, this is an area, financials around clinical trials is an area that we could probably do an entire afternoon workshop on. So the one key takeaway we want you to know coming into this is just because the Workday says your budget is $500,000 does not mean you have $500,000 to spend. So the difference with budgets and for grants and budgets for industry-sponsored clinical trials is we looked at those categories for grants where you're looking at personnel, effort, and salary. You're looking at travel and, specific materials and supplies that you're buying. When you're looking at industry, they are looking at what your site costs are versus what your per subject costs are. So your site costs are going to include things like your startup and closeout costs, regulatory activities, so submitting that IRB, both maybe to your local IRB or to a central IRB. Administrative and research maintenance fees. When we get to talking about some of the per subject and when I show examples here, those administrative and research maintenance fees become really important because we don't charge personnel effort in clinical trials like we do in grants. It's not based on, oh, I think, it's going to take 25% effort for somebody to do this work. In clinical trials, we're much more literal about our time. Is it going to take a study coordinator 2 hours or 4 hours to do this specific, all of the activities in this specific visit? So some of those maintenance fees help give us a little bit of buffer in that space. UW Health units, we have to get quotes if you're going to work with the pharmacy at UW Health, if you have a drug that's having to be administered, if you need to work with the clinical research unit, or if you have imaging, if you're working with radiology at the hospital, or the Wiseman or Wimmer centers, or if you're doing labs. Are we doing local labs through the hospital, or are we sending them off to the sponsor's central lab? All of these things are important for building around this budget and knowing who we have to work with, because These units, PRC, CRU, imaging, they'll have their own startup costs separate from you as a department. And then there's report and audit fees. So if we get audited, we want to be able to recoup the costs that are going into the personnel time who have to spend going through that audit. If you're doing SAE or IND reporting, there's extra time that has to go into that that isn't included in the per subject visit fees. So you want to account for a lot of that. And then, like I said, so you have your site costs and then you have your per subject fees. And your subject fees are really going to be based on the procedures and the visits of the actual study. And so if you don't budget what you need for the procedures for the patients, as well as your site costs, it can be hard to go back to a sponsor and say, oh, we're not covering costs with this trial. That's not really the sponsor's problem. So trying to go back to them and say, well, things aren't breaking even. Do you think you can give us some more money? That becomes a real challenge later on. So this is one where you have to try and guesstimate all of the things that you're going to need ahead of time. Can you go back and renegotiate budgets on these? Yes, absolutely. That is a much more feasible accomplishment on an industry-sponsored clinical trial than it is on a grant. And then remembering that with industry-sponsored stuff, just because it's in the budget doesn't mean you're getting paid for it. A lot of the budget is based on an event happening or an occurrence of something happening. So for instance, submitting an IRB application, submitting a continuing review application. If you have an SAE, you'll have SAEs budgeted, but maybe you don't have any. That's a really bad example because we usually do, but maybe you don't have any. So you don't get paid for those, but they're on your budget. They're submission and occurrence based. So looking at an example, this first page, these are an example. So this is from DOM. So this is our clinical trial template for all of our site fees. So these are all of the potential items that we may incur charges for administrative activities. So whereas in grants, we are really looking at like putting in personnel time at 25 or 50% effort to do the grant activities. That's where a lot of this is built in, is the personnel time that it takes for IRB submission, for SAE reporting, for different sites like the pharmacy or CRU to do their startup activities. A lot of those are built into the site cost. So that's where we have here. You will notice DOM does build in on that right-hand side of the screenshot. We have principal investigator administrative fees. We also have co-investigator, project manager, as well as our research and administrative fees. And yes, we will share this for those who would like a copy of it, along with the slides. We put all of those in, and we've had a lot of luck getting those funded. So we get PI time, and we'll see this on the next page. We get PI and coordinator time for specific visits, but we also get PI and coordinator time administrative coverage under these maintenance fees. So these are kind of the site costs that we throw out and negotiate back and forth. And this is kind of our starting place. And then you get into the per subject. And this is just an example that I took from one of our studies where you have all of the procedures that they want you to complete across all of the visits, and then when they're going to happen. You'll notice some of these boxes have SOC. Those activities during that visit is being considered as standard of care. And or we're using the standard of care. In this case, I think the first one that I see there is for the transthoracic endocardiogram. So they were going, they were going to use the last echo that had been done for the patient as standard of care as the baseline screening event. So we didn't have to do that as a research activity. But again, knowing what is standard of care during those visits versus what actually needs to be charged. So where all of the ones are for us tells us that that is being charged directly to the research project. We wouldn't do it otherwise. And then you'll also notice towards the bottom of this, we have our physician fees, our research nurse fees. If this was an old one, so we had CRU visit fees rather than the level fees. We also, for a lot of our clinics, put in clinic fees. Because if we're going to take up clinic space or clinic time with research activities, we allow the clinics to charge us for that time if they would like to. And we do have a few of our clinics, like the Digestive Health Center, who will occasionally charge us for those. Those numbers down there indicate the number of hours. So like when you're looking at the physician or the research nurse, the quantity there is the number of hours that they think it's going to take to complete that visit. And we have a little bit of buffer because we know that in looking at this, our consents are really coordinator time. You'll notice we have a dollar amount there, and we also have it in coordinator time. So that gives us a little buffer so that if dollar amounts change for procedures over a certain period, we know we still have a little bit of buffer. And also if our sponsors get a little bit agitated with us over the number of hours that we're putting in, we know we've got some time built into the individual procedures as well for our coordinators. So if we need to lessen some of the hours to get that to align with sponsor expectations, we're able to do that. A lot of this, it's like buying a car. The sponsor is going to come in super low with the numbers. They're going to throw out the numbers that they want to pay for this, and we're going to come in high. So we typically start with retail rates. And that goal is to, by the time we get down to it, the sponsor has given a little bit and come up, and we've given a little bit and come down, and we've met the encore industry rate then. And or maybe a little bit more just to put some buffer because some of these things do change a little bit as we go. One of the questions that came up was, how do we account for shifts in costs with working with like the clinical research unit, the CRU, or with procedure costs at the hospital going up 1 or 2% every year. We'll build that into the costs as part of our negotiation to see if we can get that in. And or we can put a comment in our contract that in the payment terms that says that the procedural fees may be subject to 1% increases per year dependent on hospital billing increases. And then we're able to go back and show them, hey, our hospital went up in this price. Are you willing to meet that? And we've had success with that with our sponsors as well. So there is that wiggle room to be able to come back. For the clinical research unit, if we have a procedure or something that's like kind of right on the edge between the different levels that they provide, like it's right on the edge between a level 2 and a level 3, we will always budget at level 3. We'll just go with the higher one. If it's a level 3, but it's really complicated and we still haven't gotten the quote back from CRU, we might even budget at a level 4 just to be on the actual safe side, in case CRU comes back and goes, yeah, this is going to be a little bit more complicated than we thought it was, so we're going to charge you this higher rate. Because we do have some struggles there with getting the quotes back from the CRU before we need to, in time for full negotiation with the sponsors. So I've talked a lot about budget here. Let me scan back through the questions. And so far I just see, we wanted to talk about brand new unexpected charges, such as upcoming REDCap fees. Yes, so we actually, and if I go back here, sorry, we have down here, wow, that really went all the way back on my slides there. Let's try this again. There we go. On our site fees, we have a REDCap database service fee. So we actually already have that in because DOM at one point in time had their own instance of REDCap. And so when our developers would do development for a project, or if we knew that we were going to have a lot of data and a lot of maintenance that was going to require input from our REDCap team, we would build some of those costs in. So that is something that we know may be coming. So we may end up putting that in as a site cost because it's not necessarily related. It's related to the procedures if we're having to keep track of the data, but it's not necessarily specific to individual participants or visits. So we may just put it on as a site cost, and that could be a monthly fee. It could be quarterly, however you want to set it up. So that is an option to put things like that in. And we've also had weird things come up because the sponsors are coming back and querying us on the data that we're putting into the electronic data capture. They're coming back and asking questions repeatedly. We'll go back to them and say, hey, we've noticed, there's a brand new charge because, for instance, we've had right heart catheters with our cardiovascular group, where in two of our studies, our clinical trial studies, they found that they needed to do an EKG before they proceeded with the right heart catheter because of where the item they were implanting was going to go. We had not originally budgeted for that initial EKG because it wasn't standard of care for a right heart catheter to normally do that. So they didn't think that they would have to do that just for the procedure. As they were going through it, they found that they really needed to. And so we went back to the sponsor and asked them about that, getting a budget amendment, getting a contract amendment if necessary at that point to add those new fees. Again, that's a much more feasible area to come back and have those conversations to say things have changed and we may need more money in industry-sponsored trials, whereas it's not as feasible on the federal or nonprofit side of grants. So last topic that we're going to talk a little bit about are investigator-initiated. To be clear, investigator-initiated has several different meanings to people. So if you talk to a PI who is submitting a federal grant proposal to the NIH, that is an investigator-initiated study. So in this realm, we're going to talk about investigator-initiated non-federal grants. So remember when I talked about at the beginning, the IDC, there was an industry research IDC of 64%. So this is where industry is giving money. So we'll use Pfizer as our example, is giving money to a foundation. So let's say Pfizer is giving money to the Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to fund a research study on heart arrhythmias. Because it is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation may have an indirect policy of 10%. But because Merck or Pfizer or whoever is giving the money to that foundation and they've disclosed that in their call for announcement that it's an industry sponsor funding it, our university will require us to use our 64% industry sponsored research rate. And so one of the things that faculty need to be aware of going into that is if you submit the proposal with that, the foundation may say, nope, it doesn't follow policy, so we can't meet that. So you want to have that conversation up front before you submit that. And then if you have to submit at the foundation rate, there may be requirements for you as the PI or your department to make up the difference in that clinical trial or in that indirect cost rate between what we charge for our industry rate versus what you are allowed to bill to the sponsor for their IDC rate. So things to keep in mind when industry is funding research through foundations. Budgets for these are very typically like grants. You're doing personnel costs and effort, you're doing materials, contractual services, etc. And so they are also usually cost reimbursable. So as you spend, you get paid back provided your spend aligns with the grant. The IDC rate, as I talked about, is the industry research rate, not the foundation rate. And if there is a difference and the foundation will only accept applications with their rate, then PIs are expected to cover that difference. That is a university policy. So now we're going to kind of transition talking a little bit about differences between industry-funded clinical trials that engage only a single site under investigator-initiated. So you are an investigator. For instance, we have a new drug that has come out that is to benefit Alzheimer's patients. It is FDA approved, newly FDA approved. So the expectation of the sponsor is that practicing clinicians who have Alzheimer's patients potentially prescribe this medication to their patients, and it helps. Well, some of our clinicians came back and said, well, that's great, but we haven't seen any research that actually shows, and the clinical trials that you did on this didn't necessarily prove to us that your drug is beneficial to our patients. So we would be interested in running a trial that does actual PET and MRI scans to look and see if there is actual reduction of tau in the brain that reduces or reverses Alzheimer's symptoms. The sponsor came back and said, you know what, that'd be great. This will help promote our drug and get us more patients and help physicians feel more comfortable. So we will pay you as an investigator-initiated trial for you to do this study. Industry is going to fund us, but we are sponsoring it because it is RPI's idea. It is their research that they are doing. So we are the sponsor for that investigator-initiated study. Industry just happens to be funding us. The budgets will align, and I don't know why my page just stopped turning here. The budgets will align with the standard clinical trial budgets that we do, though there may be some things that they are not willing to pay because we are the actual sponsoring site. So we've noticed that sometimes sponsors aren't willing to pay our research staff training startup for investigator-initiated trials that industry is paying, because we would have to train our staff to do that study without their money anyway. So we tend to throw the standard clinical trial budget at them and just wait to see if they tell us they have any issues. Investigator-initiated studies will also typically require going through scientific review committee, as well as, again, if Pfizer is going to pay us to do this study because they want the data and the results out of it, it may have to go through their committees to review your study protocol to make sure it aligns and meets their needs. So you may have dual reviews that need to happen either as part of your IRB or prior to your IRB submission to get that study protocol reviewed and approved. If you are looking at using a drug or a device that is off-label, you may need to, as part of your study, you may need to get FDA IND approval in order to do that prior to putting that through. So being aware that there may be some additional, as an investigator-initiated clinical trial, there may be some other steps that you have to do, especially when drugs and devices are part of your study. Study monitoring. Again, if you're using a drug or a device, with industry-sponsored trials where they bring us the study, they expect to monitor it. They want to make sure that we're following the protocol with our visits, that our IRB aligns, and that we're keeping to it. And so they'll send monitors in to monitor our clinical trial studies and make sure that we're doing that. If we are the sponsor and we are the ones who started this up, that same monitoring is typically expected by the sponsor, or the funder, rather, the industry. But that becomes an internal monitoring that we have to do. And so SMPH has Jake Rome's group that does a lot of that FDA and study monitoring. It has to be a team that is separate from the team that is performing the study activities, because it has to be somebody that the PI, if there are findings, there's no ramification for them there's no conflict of interest for them for reporting those findings back to the PI and saying you must fix these because they're not compliant. So ICTR's monitoring services are there to help support that when you're doing investigator-initiated studies. You'll have clinicaltrials.gov registration that you'll need to do. And again, we have partners on campus who can help with that registration and getting that information in and help the study teams and PIs navigate that. UW Health Medicare compliance reviews. Those are things that will have to happen to ensure clinical trial studies are coded correctly for Medicare compliance. This ensures that we're able to charge those study activities, drugs, devices, etc., correctly, either to the research study, to the patient as standard of care, or as to Medicare. And making sure that we're keeping those procedure costs labeled as research versus standard of care, that you know what it is, and it needs to be done consistently across all patients. You can't have some patients be standard of care in the study for this visit and this procedure and others be research. That starts to get really complicated on the UW Health billing side, so you have to pick a lane. If it's research for one person, then it's research for all of them. So keeping that in mind. And then these are a few things that you need to think about if you are an investigator who wants to have other sites outside of UW participate in your research study. So same study that we're looking at, if we decided that we wanted to have Marquette run our study at their site and get participants and get feedback, or the Wisconsin Medical College, if we wanted them to participate, then it would be a multi-site investigator-initiated study. And so we would serve as the primary clinical trial site, and the other sites would be participating sites. And the costs for those participating sites then need to be included in our budgets that go back to Pfizer for review as our overall study budget. Things to consider when it's a multi-site investigator initiated. Are you going to have local IRB do it versus a central IRB? Who's managing the participating sites? So it's a lot of work for our study teams to manage and maintain our own trial activities at our site. Are you expecting them to monitor the study teams and manage and train the study teams at those participating sites? Or do you want help with that? Because ICTR has a multi-research support services group that can help manage multi-site clinical trials. They can help train the sites, make sure that they're getting their IRBs approved, monitoring of those sites, etc. That comes with a cost, but you build that in as part of your site costs, and then you get that help so that it's not on your study team and their responsibility to do that. So a couple of questions that have come in. Sorry, scrolling back. So how is an investigator to come up with the money difference between a foundation's indirect rate and UW's indirect rate? That comes back to, does the PI have any discretionary funding? If your department gets CapEx back, do you distribute that back to, does any share of that go back to the PIs? If you are doing clinical trials and there are residuals left of that, what is your department's policy on residual balance distribution? Does some of that go back to the PI? Do you have philanthropic funds that could be used toward research purposes that could help make up that difference? Those are kind of the areas, and or looking at the department to say, are you willing to help cost share this to cover this overage? So that is not an easy question to answer because it really depends on the PI, their department, and their willingness to even be part of that study then, or to submit that proposal? Or is there another avenue that you can submit the same research without having that cost be yours to bear? And next question was, I think it's really confusing about how an investigator-initiated trial that is funded by industry work out the details and IP and data ownership. Can we have a whole session on this? I'm going to let Teresa and Nasia speak to that. But yes, when we're doing investigator-initiated studies, most of the contracts that come to us from industry, when they come to us, don't really talk about IP and data ownership other than each site owns their own data and their own IP. So therefore, UW doesn't have any rights to the revenues, the IP, or any of that that's generated against the drug that we're using or the research that's being done, because we weren't the ones who developed that. Whereas when we're doing this locally, and it's RPI's data and research, typically it benefits the industry sponsors that we get to fund this. We've had a few industry sponsors fund some of our clinical trials simply because they wanted the information because it would help promote their drug and the efficacy of their drug and include and help people use it more often. So that was usually enough for them not to worry about the IP rights, unless we were taking a previously owned drug that was still in research space. So it had not been fully FDA approved and or was still at a proprietary level and trying to use it for alternative methods. Then we could see some IP coming into it there, where drug companies might want to have a lot more engagement in that. One of the questions was, what's the name of ICTR's monitoring service? I think it's ICTR's monitoring service. I think that is the name that it's actually listed on the website under. You could also Google under UW, if you Google UW-Madison Jake, Jake, Rome, Rome, I believe his unit comes up then. You can also put in there ICTR monitoring service, and I believe it comes up as well. And that pretty much, central monitoring. Thank you, Teresa. Central monitoring service. That brings us to our summary. So kind of what have we covered today? Really the PI's responsibilities. Know that you are responsible for all aspects of the study. You've got to know what's going on at all times. And approval means formal documentation, not just informal conversations. Know your study type. Are you getting funded through federal, industry, investigator initiated, etc.? Budgeting matters, especially according to what your funding type is. Federal, budget what you need, because you're not going to get additional funds later. There are, again, caveats to that, but more often than not, what you get is all you get. Industry budgets differently than federal grants, and understanding the difference between IDC rates across our funding types. And lastly, operations and compliance. Know what studies activation requires in order to actually say we have started activation. Know what you need system-wise: Encore, RAMP, Workday, REDCap for tracking study visits and billing purposes. Ensure billing compliance. That is really important, both for us as a university and what we're billing to the sponsors, but UW Health is our partner. It's really important that we're putting charge slips incorrectly to bill to the correct places. Risks to avoid: performing work outside of our contracts and protocol. Again, if it's not in the contract and not in the protocol and you do it, you're not getting paid. Incorrect billing or documentation. If we have things labeled incorrectly, that means we can't bill for them, and or potentially our participants are getting charged for things they shouldn't be. So again, paying attention to that billing compliance and understanding, a risk to avoid is underestimating the costs, the timelines, and the oversight requirements that go into research. Keys to success: talk to your research support teams early. If you're thinking about getting involved, loop them in. Even if you're like, you don't even really know what the sponsor is offering, or you're not even sure you're going to submit the proposal, it doesn't matter. Come talk to your research team. They want to know early because they can give you checklists, they can give you timelines, they can look at feasibility, they can talk about what needs to happen so that you're able to get your ducks in a row. So it's great to get them engaged. They can help you plan proactively for your budgets, your regulatory, and study management. You know, what goes into getting things up. And when you're unsure, ask. Don't assume just because you've done it once on one study that's how it's going to work on the next study. Just ask the question. I can tell you all of our research administrators would happily have you ask the same question 10 times and get it right because you asked the question and got the answer versus assume, get it wrong, and then have to go and do the cleanup. And that leads us to questions. And I hope this was useful information to everybody.